Good morning, everybody. As Linda said, I'm Nancy Bell, also co-chairing this committee with her. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Before I introduce our speakers, just a quick review of what we're going to be covering during the course of today's meeting. For those of you who aren't committee members, you might decide to stick around. So the first half of the meeting will be our speaker presentation. And then we're going to be introducing an exciting new campaign that the California League is co-sponsoring called Drive Clean with the League. And we will be participating in that this summer with them. And after that, we'll wrap up with committee work. So for today's presentation, Climate Change and the League, Positions and Actions. A little review exactly what is a position. I recall when I joined the League some years ago, it took a while for me to figure that out. So I just wanted to kind of put this in context. The US League says the following about positions. The League of Women Voters takes action on an issue only when we have a position addressing that particular issue. Members must study and come to consensus on an issue in order to form a position. This thorough grassroots process ensures that our advocacy is well considered by a broad range of people, understood by our members, and we have a sense of the political environment. So today's speakers are going to focus on those positions, both national and California state, that address issues specifically around climate change. And I can't think of anyone more appropriate to educate us on these positions. Our first speaker is going to be Eleanor Revell. Currently, Eleanor is co-chair of the US League's Climate Change Task Force, which is a network of League members across the country who are taking action to fight climate change. She also served as a board member for the US League for 8 years. I also want to congratulate Eleanor on her re-election to the Evanston City Council earlier this month. Okay, after Eleanor, then we're going to hear from April Oquenda. God, April, sorry, I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your last name. Oquenda, who serves on the California State League's Climate Change Task Force. April previously served on the board of the League of Eden, the League of Eden area. She currently serves at the state level as the legislative analyst on the Climate Change Committee and the deputy area director of social policy. At the national level, she leads the Climate Justice Committee. I don't know how you find time, April. I'm impressed. April is also dedicated to community service and volunteer work. She serves as board president of the Hayward Unified School District Board of Education. Her focus is on equity and opportunity. April authored the board policy on anti-racism, which was approved in 2020. So with no further ado, I'm going to toss this over to Eleanor. Dee Dee's going to share your slides for you, and Eleanor will be talking to us about the national positions on climate change and their actions.
Great, yeah. So, well, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be with Marin County League members and to talk about the National League positions that empower our action on climate change. So if we can look at the first slide, please. The next slide. There we go. So beginning in the 1970s, the League developed a broad range of positions aimed at protecting the interrelated aspects of air, water, land use, energy, and waste management. Using these positions, the League has been at the forefront of the environmental protection. Whoops, I'm not ready for that one. There we go. The environmental protection movement ever since. Climate change was not part of the League's active vocabulary at the time, but these positions supported League work on what I think we would certainly recognize today as climate issues. For example, promoting energy conservation and renewable energy, recycling, tighter fuel efficiency standards, and so on. So we weren't using the word climate change at that time, but we certainly were addressing those kinds of issues. Next slide, please. So I think the earliest League action that's directly related to climate change came with the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Leagues hosted conferences and town hall meetings to gather citizen input for the Earth Summit agenda, and leagues urged the administration of then President Bush to participate fully in the summit. The results of the Earth Summit included a very important treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a binding treaty aimed at stabilizing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The US did sign that treaty, and thus that allows the US to participate in the annual Conference of the Parties meetings, you often referred to as COP, and each one gets a new number. Next slide, please. Then 5 years later, in 1997, the annual COP meeting was held in Kyoto, Japan. It established binding emissions reduction targets for industrialized nations, but the US Senate passed a resolution opposing the Kyoto Protocol. Leagues lobbied their senators to reject actions that undermine efforts to stop global warming, but the US remained one of the very few nations that failed to sign the Kyoto Protocol. In recent years, just continuing the focus for a minute on the international scene, the League has sent League members to participate as observers at many of the COP meetings. And we have strongly supported US participation in these international negotiations ever since. Next slide, please. Okay. So the debate over the Kyoto Protocol brought heightened attention to climate change. And the following year, the LWVUS issued a global warming Q&A. And this is just one question and answer from it. It's quite an extensive set of questions and answers that goes on for several pages. But this was really the League's very first official statement on climate change. And in it, the League expressed support for the Kyoto Protocol, and we urged the government to take immediate steps to reduce US greenhouse gas emissions, even without the Senate ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. And perhaps many of you live in communities where your municipality decided that you would, as a local government, you would try to comply with the Kyoto Protocol emissions reductions. So it was very disappointing that the national government failed to do that, but there was a lot of effort at the state and local levels to comply with the Kyoto Protocol emissions reduction targets. I think we're ready for the next slide. So in the years since, the League has been a strong voice in support of major initiatives aimed at fighting climate change. And these include things like measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles and from power plants, legislation aimed at putting a price on carbon, and unwavering support for US engagement in international climate negotiations. Next slide, please. Internally, the League also responded to League members' growing alarm about the climate crisis. And in 2006, the National Board appointed a climate change task force, and I was designated as a task force chair. Since I'd been on the National Board and my main role there had been working on program advocacy and education, I think I was a known quantity for the National Board. So we worked closely with national advocacy staff, provided advice about legislation, and we developed materials to help state and local leagues work on climate change in their state and in their communities. It's hard to think now that League members really needed background papers on climate change, but we did because we really hadn't been as immersed in the issue as we are today. And then very recently, just in 2019, as part of a major rewrite of Impact on Issues, which is kind of our Bible of National League positions, the National Board adopted a formal position statement on climate change. And it's a pretty basic statement, but it it reassures League members that we do really have an official national position on climate change. Next slide, please. And leading up to the 2020 National Convention just last year, a group of League climate activists from across the country worked together to promote the inclusion of climate change in the 2020-2022 LWVUS program. And indeed, the program that was adopted at the convention designates climate change as an urgent issue for action. After the convention, this working group of League activists merged with the existing climate change task force to be called now, we're basically an expanded climate change task force with all the original members of the task force, as well as now the new members from the working group. This expanded climate change task force is organized. We have 11 different teams of members from around the country working on a host of really important climate issues, as you can see from this list here. And you're going to hear a little bit more about one of those in a few minutes from April. But there's, it's really exciting to see these members from around the country. Thank heavens for the internet and Zoom meetings to be able to work together very effectively on these really critical issues. And then there's one of the teams is focused on looking at federal legislation. Next slide, please. So this new climate change task force, we're in the process of working towards some kind of formal recognition from the national board. And if we have that national recognition, I mean, we will have it. It's just a matter of putting together the documents. Then we will be able to have a more visible presence for our membership across the country. We'll be able to have an official place you can find us on the National League website. There'll be regular information in the League updates, and we'll have a board liaison with the national board. So we think that will be very helpful in terms of reaching members who aren't already part of our mini teams. So we welcome all of you to engage with the Climate Change Task Force. If any of those topics appeal to you, there's definitely, the teams would welcome new members. They meet roughly once a month by Zoom and are really developing a lot of important good resources. There will be the occasional webinar to attend on a variety of topics. And then we'll be issuing a lot of resources and talking points to help state and local leagues work on climate issues at their level. And then just on the last slide, these are some of the issues that the legislation team is following at the moment. These are kind of the high priority issues. There seems to be a good possibility for some movement on climate pricing. I'm sure you'll hear from April some more about environmental and climate justice is a really strong priority for the League. There's an interesting bill on women and climate because of the disproportionate impact on women of climate change. Then, of course, we want to see what's going to be in Biden's infrastructure bill, because there'll be a lot of issues there that will be related to climate change. And then, of course, we're eagerly awaiting the announcement at the Earth Day Summit in a couple of days about what the new target's going to be for the US in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So as part of our rejoining the Paris Agreement, we need to say revise our targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions for 2030. So I think that's it from me for the moment, and I look forward to your questions later.
Should I just begin, Nancy? I think you're muted.
Yeah, you could just jump in. That's great.
Great. Well, again, thank you all so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you some of the positions and actions that the state has taken, and also to share with you a little bit about climate justice work that we're doing at the national level. So thank you, and I'll go ahead and start. Just a quick recap. I want to give you a sense of where I'm coming from in this work. So when the climate change steering team, we're pretty new. I think it was 4 years ago at convention. Diz Swift was having a talk, and I attended, and I asked her afterward if I could help, and she said, well, great, but it'd kind of just be us. And then we had a few other members, including Gloria Chunhu. And so we were able to start this task force. We're now called the steering team. So it's grown so big, which is wonderful. And we focused a lot on educating other leagues, reaching out to other leagues, including Marin, and seeing what all of you were doing and trying to coalesce all the information. So of course, one of the tactics we use is pushing for legislation, but it's really been such a rewarding experience to see so many impassioned people getting involved with this very important issue of climate change. I also recently, I was a deputy area director under Diz, under natural resources, and then I recently was moved over to social policy because I have of course, in education, that's my, most of my work is there. And issues related to social justice, racial justice, that's a really core focus for me. So it was a nice transition to go there, but I now kind of work in both. So that'll make more sense when we're talking about the issue of climate justice and how that relates to DEI within the league. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, you all probably know that's been a big push recently for California League. And then the climate justice team is really new. We're not even a year old. And that was a recognition that, again, that intersection of DEI. And so I'll just share a little bit about the progress that we're making and what we're up to in that sense. I've just taken a quick screenshot here on the right. You can read these more in depth, but I wanted to highlight how many positions there are on natural resources. And what I'm going to primarily be focusing on the state level ones, but there is a lot of overlap. And so we'll just kind of break those down. But I want to encourage you to, if there are any of these that you would like more information on, those are live links, and you can just click on them and read more specifically what the positions are there. We don't have time today to go into all of them, but I just wanted you to see what the different variety or areas of focus are. And then of course we have position directors in each one of those areas. So I'll just share with you here, and hold on, let me make myself go away for a moment so I can see. So the League of Women Voters of California supports actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So mitigate is important there, and then adapt, that we're doing our best to avoid having to have these issues. So, I'm sure for you and Marin, looking at sea level rise, or what are the things that we can start doing now to prevent that from building in places that we know are going to be impacted by sea level rise. And then adapting as needed to, retrofit homes or whatever's needed in specific areas. If we keep reading, in order to protect our state from negative physical, economic, and public health effects. And we just know that climate issues reach out into every aspect of the way that we live our lives. Local leagues and ILOs are urged to engage at their local and regional levels. And then you can see here the different areas, again, where we're focused. So it's such a vast topic and requires so many areas of expertise and experts that we draw on. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later, how, our small little steering team, we aren't expert in all of these things. And so how do we educate ourselves about what positions we want to take and what legislation that we want to support? But it is nice to have this action policy as just a way to anchor in on the work that we're focused on, and how to stay really focused so that we don't get drawn out into too many different directions. So just wanted to share these bullet points with you as well. And again, this is all on the website, so if you'd like to spend more time with it, it's there. Related to California actions, more than 62 of our local leagues already have an active, or they're in the beginning stages of starting a climate change team. So this is really exciting. As I mentioned, when the task force first formed, one of our first goals was to reach out and just see who can we work with here, and who can we collaborate with and get ideas from to share. It was the goal was to create this kind of hub of information for leagues, regardless of where they were in the process of forming a team, to have resources to draw upon. And then looking smart growth or climate action plans. This has been one of the I guess, biggest ways that leagues have been able to push their local governments to adopt something related to smart growth. And then, of course, in rural areas, we're focused a lot on carbon conservation and methods for drawing down. So healthy soils and agriculture, food. This is a big push that we see in Central California specifically. Coastal communities, as we already mentioned, are focused on sea level rise. And so looking at how that affects zoning, housing, where transportation is being built. And then lastly, education. That this is, again, a topic that has so many areas, and a lot of it really technical. If you get into issues of electrification, you have to really get a hang of the lingo in order to even keep up with what they're talking about. So really working to educate members across the league and hosting forums like this, and reaching out to people who are experts to share what we need to learn. If we're looking more at the US level, I just wanted to focus on the 20 to 22 program. And this is looking at the Making Democracy Work, the 4 pillars. This was really big that climate change was adopted as the 5th pillar. So this is when we see it at the national level in that way, it's just really gratifying to know that the work we're doing is being pushed then across other states, because we know that climate change is not really just a local issue. It affects the entire globe. And so as much as we can start to reach across that and work with one another, that's really key for our being able to succeed in that mitigation and adaptation plan. And then also the US League declared a climate emergency, which is, of course, obvious to all of you here. Since you're here, you know that. And then the state of California, I believe it was 2 years ago at convention, we also adopted that declaring a state of emergency there. So again, just the fact that this has been elevated in such a way within the league is incredibly gratifying to the work we've been doing. And of course, we all know how overdue this is, and it really does require this sense of urgency. So where do we go when we need experts? There are a lot of great resources within people doing work in the state of California. And these are just a few of the organizations that we've worked with. We also, when we're trying to decide which legislation we want to support and what positions we can draw upon for that, it is really nice to have allies and friends in some of these organizations. So, and it's a great way also to track legislation, to see what work they're doing, what bills they're focused on. And so it's really a collaborative experience in that way. And the league in the climate change task force, we're not siloed off doing this by ourselves. And of course, it's obvious that when you're working in coalition, you have a stronger voice, you have more power to make change. And so it's great to have these partnerships, and we're really grateful, especially for Green California serves as this kind of umbrella that all of these groups are in. And so they send out regular emails, and we can keep up to date moment by moment of what's happening in the legislature and paying attention to the bills that we're following. So just want to highlight a few of these organizations in case you're interested in looking into the work that they're doing. When the Climate Change Task Force recently looked at what are some of the trends that we're seeing in legislation in California, this goes back to some of the conversation we were having around the positions in California. Sea level rise is one of the biggest ones, having so many coastal communities. And then I'm sure Diz showed you, that map of what it would look like if, certain levels of rise happened and how far inland that would go, all the way to the 5 freeway. And so this issue of sea level rise, it's not just going to impact our coastal communities. So really paying closer attention to that and how we can work to mitigate the impact of what is probably inevitably going to be sea level rise. This should come as no surprise that in the last couple years, there's been a big emphasis, but particularly after last year, the wildfire prevention and looking generally at what's happening in the forestry and the not just at the the U.S. Forest Department, but also CAL FIRE and then city level. So how can we work to make sure that we're not building in high fire areas? How are we, a lot with insurance related legislation, and are we being smart about the places where we're practicing forestry? So this one in particular in the last few years we've seen a huge surge in legislation. Electrification, as we're talking about smart growth and we're talking about new buildings that are coming in, there's been a big push to electrify, and then ways to incentivize housing or people who own homes already to push for, if you need a new appliance, get electric. And so there's so much work to be done here, but electrification is one of those that, again, we've seen a big push because there's so much awareness now of the large impact that electrification could have on us meeting our goals to bring down carbon. Also with electrification, we've seen a push with the grid. So looking at, and what happened recently in Texas is a great example of this, but there have been a push to move out into Texas, Nevada, and other surrounding states to increase our grid so that we're sharing and able to, when we have a surge of electricity, it just kind of goes away if it's not used. We don't have a great battery system. So a lot of focus on that, like how to make the best use and work collaboratively with our with the states surrounding us. So a regional push there. And that leads to the next one. So regional efforts to address climate change. Again, we know this is not something that happens in just one small location. It affects everybody. And then adaptation, which we've already talked a lot about, but a lot of work related, or a lot of legislation related to climate adaptation plans. So this is a word we've just noticed has been coming up a lot recently in legislation. So as we're looking at the positions, there is this really nice correlation between what we see happening in the legislation and the way that bills are being written. So it's nice to see that coalescence and knowing that we've kind of, had our finger on the pulse in a sense of being able to anticipate what was going to be needed. So this one I want to focus on here, that when we're looking at action specifically, that the impacts of global warming are not felt equitably. We know this, that people who are furthest from opportunity, people who are living in poverty or socioeconomically disadvantaged communities, or these are the people who are going to be hit the hardest. And so when we look at that, we're looking at how to bring the DEI lens to the forefront of the work that we're doing in climate, and not just related to climate justice at the US level, but even through the legislation, and then really looking again at our positions to see if our positions have been strong enough to address this problem. And so this is really, I feel, the direction that we've been heading, and where we are going to direct even more of our attention is pushing back on positions or pushing back on bills and asking if they're hitting hard enough, if they're really addressing this issue in the way that it deserves to be addressed. So this is looking into the future where we're really going to have to hunker down and pay closer attention. And so we use the term climate justice, but I want to be clear that it's different than environmental justice. So this you can find on the League of Women Voters of the United States climate justice. If you Google that, you'll see, and this is how our group has defined it. They are not interchangeable. So a lot of people tend to use them interchangeably, but they are two different things. And so I just want to focus that we're really looking in the work of climate justice about mitigation. So focusing on dismantling the barriers that create inequities in the first place. And you can think about how broad sweeping that is. Something like an inequity in education is a barrier that can affect, right, that have disproportionate outcomes on how much money people make, how, where they live. So this is where we really want to look at the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racist practices, and how that intersects with the work of environmental justice. And so that's where we get to climate. And we're looking, again, ecologically, that we know we can't siphon out any of this work. It has to be done holistically. So this is the work of the US Climate Justice team. So if you'd like to join us in any way, the climate justice team, you can contact me personally. I can type my email address in the chat. We also have our climate change steering team. The email address there is climatechange@leagueofwomenvoterscalifornia.org. And then of course, convention is coming up and we'll be giving a talk at convention. So we hope that you'll join us there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, April and Eleanor. It was great. Just a reminder on the handling of questions. Please enter them in the chat. If you would like to ask the question yourself, just enter a question mark in the chat and we will ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question at the appropriate time. So right now, Kiki has mentioned, she said, expanding the Western electricity grid, is not necessarily the best way to go. I am glad the League is studying it. There are many considerations related to California's production of solar power that come into play. This deserves further research. Any comments on that?
Only to say that, Kiki, I agree. We were looking at, I believe it was AB 813 2 years ago, and that was looking at the regional grid. And this is where we really did have to bring experts in. We talked to people from the NRDC and had to talk to our electrification expert. It is a controversial issue, but inevitably we have to find a way to either store electricity or to figure out where to send it so that it's not going to waste. So it is a complex issue, and ultimately we decided over a lot of deliberation that we did support AB 813, but it wasn't without some heated and in-depth conversations. So if you'd like to join our team, we'd be happy to have your input on that.
Great. And Lynn has put into, or somebody put into the chat about where to send an email on any of that. So Robin asked about electrification. Do you mean versus using natural gas?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Anybody else have questions? There must be some out there. So,
Linda, there is one here.
oh, where?
From Robin about electrification. Do you mean using, what are you saying? Mean using natural gas?
That's what I just asked.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Don't mind me.
It's okay. To dig a little deeper into that, I know I sat in on a city council meeting here and they were talking about, and it's quite extensive of what that actually really does mean. It just doesn't mean a gas stove. There's a lot of other things involved in that. Is that correct, or am I?
Yes, and really thinking about getting not just solar on buildings to be able to predict, right, that they're self-sufficient, but also looking at any appliance that we can push into, so water heaters, for example. But this is not my area of expertise. Eric Ahrens is our electrification person. So if you go too much more in depth, I will not be able to say very much, but he's a great resource if you want a more in-depth answer to any of this.
Yeah. Eleanor, across the country, have you been seeing any pushback by certain states other than others, or do you not get that deep into it?
Well, climate change is a more controversial issue in some parts of the country. And so we do have League members who bring those concerns to the task force. But we can find ways to talk about climate change without using that actual term. When we talk about the health impacts of climate change, that's an issue that really resonates with everybody. And so leagues in Alabama, for example, find ways to talk about, find ways to address climate change by talking about health impacts, for example. So it is, we have to be sensitive to who our audience is wherever we are, and
Sure.
The messages will be different in different parts of the country.
A question here. There will be an expansion of California's requirements for electricity of approximately sixfold as we electrify everything. Other members of the Western Grid Consortium do not have California's ethics ethos around renewables. I am concerned about losing the ability to manage our own supply needs. Any comments there?
Just what I said before, I think Kiki's expanding on her question from earlier, and this is, it is a very complex subject, and I am not expert on this either. So just that, Kiki, again, I agree that it's not, it needs to be done thoughtfully, and there are things that we have to consider, especially in nearby states that don't have similar pushes for electrification and even the work around climate change. It does make it really tedious for us to move forward. So we'd have to be incredibly thoughtful. And that I agree with you, but the push is there, and that's the direction we need to go. So how do we do it in a way that works?
Right. Here in Marin, we're very lucky. Each of our city and town governments have formulated their own climate action plans and are very proactive on this. Do you find around the country and in the state, other communities are doing the same things?
Well, I'll just say that the climate action plan team of the climate change task force is probably almost our biggest and really very active teams. And what they're doing is gathering, looking at a whole lot of different climate action plans from different municipalities, and they're going to come up with sort of a list of best practices. You know, what are some key things that every good climate action plan should have, and you know, what are some implementation strategies that every climate action plan should have. So we obviously have a lot of league members from municipalities around the country that do have very good climate action plans in their communities, but they know that not every community has a good plan yet. So I think the resources that this team is putting together will be really helpful for those communities that are still need to do their own plans.
Sure. Do you find California, most communities are pretty active on this, April?
In the places you'd expect,
Okay.
how I would answer that. But I do think that the push for smart growth and urging your city councils or your local, agencies to adopt a climate action plan is a growing conversation, at least in the league across the state. So it's just a matter of how much work our local leagues going to do to push their agencies to adopt one. Okay. But we do see a good push. I mean, you and Marin are a good example of that, and having good plans that other leagues can use as a template, or even how to initiate that conversation. But I think I want to say that on the Climate Change Task Force website for the state, there is a section there about smart growth. Climate action plans is one of them. And I believe there's a toolkit that we developed for what it should be and how you would go about initiating this conversation with your local agency. So if you are curious, you can see more there as well. I know, again, Marin, you already have one, but if you're curious to see what that process would be like, or encouraging other people, there are some resources there.
Great.
And I think communities that have a good climate action plan still struggle with the implementation part, because it takes a lot of resources to really make headway on ambitious climate goals. And Evanston here where I live has a really strong climate action plan, but and we have one staff person at the city whose job it is to help implement this giant plan. And obviously he needs more resources to be able to for us to make headway on that. So I think that's an area where probably almost every community needs some help.
Here's another question here. How does climate change impact women more?
Well, I think we particularly know that from the experience of women in developing countries, where they're the ones who have to walk miles to get the water for their families, or they're trying to farm where there's drought, and just a whole lot of ways that climate impacts women in particular in developing countries. But I think even in this country, there's a feeling that we need to pay greater attention to that. I thought I would just take a look at so there's a bill that we're following to address the disparate impacts of climate change on women and support the efforts of women globally to address climate change. So it is the bill that's pending in Congress is aimed both globally as well as locally. So perhaps.
Do you have that bill number, by the way, handy?
That is House Bill 260.
260, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make a comment about the impact on women? If those of you who might be familiar with Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, they've ranked the top 100 strategies to fight climate change. And the two, if were put together, would be the #1 benefit of fighting climate change. And those are educating women and family planning. So when we think about the impacts of climate change, that in itself, I think, gives you a taste of how broad the impacts are. And it's not in line with conventional thinking of like waters are rising and things are drying out or flooding or whatever. There's a whole other impact there. So if just educating women and family planning would have the biggest impact on fighting climate change.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what Nancy, what you just said relates to something Eleanor mentioned about focusing on health issues, that if you're looking at, just as you said, that if we're being clear about healthcare and provision in that way for women globally, and then something that I mentioned earlier about education, that this is, we're looking at the base level of these issues. It is so much about things that happen early on in a person's life and set them up for the course of the rest of their life. So yeah, there is intersection with that DEI and then social policy in particular.
Well, there aren't any questions here. Does anybody have anything before we?
I do. This
Okay.
is Lynn. Hi. Yeah, that's okay. I have a question. And first of all, I wanted to say this has been fabulous and I really appreciate all the information. It's a lot of information. And basically there's a lot of confusion and it's hard to know what to do and where to focus your energy. So it's really wonderful to hear that you are doing that for us and that we have a path, which we appreciate, to legislation. That's great. And I also love the semantics efforts, that changing how you speak about things for people who find it controversial. I think that is just brilliant. My question though, and I'm sorry that I'm confused. I'm confused about environmental justice and climate justice. Would you mind speaking to that a little bit more? Because that just went right through me and I would love to learn a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah, it is. It feels a little bit like teasing hairs, but if we think about environmental justice, this is really more about prevention or repairing negative environmental impacts on marginalized communities. So focused on specific communities, and then climate justice, is much more ecological in terms of its mindset. So it's not focused on communities, it's focused on the global community, and again, holistically related to what are the problems that we need to both adapt to and mitigate, so that we're looking at a larger scale. So yeah, focused on things like education as a whole, or as we're looking at restructuring society in terms of wealth distribution, income inequality, or decreasing dependency on fossil fuels. So much more, I would say, we're on the macro, whereas environmental justice is looking at more micro, looking specific communities where we see that impact. So if that helps in any way.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
And if I may, I just want to chime back to that women issue. I wrote my dissertation on ecology, and something that a book I really that I couldn't stop thinking about is called Radical Ecology by Carolyn Merchant. And she traces, if we want to really look at the origins of what has led to global warming is an exploitation or not honoring of the planet that we live on. And she says that if she goes back to like, well, where's the origin of that? She links patriarchy, right, what happens to women within a patriarchal culture, society, world, as being specifically related to that way of looking at Mother Nature. And so how we get into these habits of exploiting the earth and not honoring it or giving it its rights, or however you want to draw comparisons between those two things. So a really great read if you're interested more in looking at how those two intersect.
What was the name of that book again?
It's called Radical Ecology by Carolyn Merchant. I'll type it into the chat here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Also, Kiki mentioned that going back to drawdown, that the number one, I just saw it and it disappeared. Replacing atmospheric destroying refrigerants is actually the number one biggest thing to buck reduction of drawdown. So, okay, great. And thanks for putting that in chat. Does anybody else? Nancy, any comments for Q&A?
Just to say, Kiki is correct, but if you combine educating women and family planning collectively, they rank higher than reducing refrigerants. That was the point on that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. It's so nice of you to join us today and I know both of you are so busy, and it's been so helpful to our committee. So thank you, and join us anytime you'd like to in our series. We would love to have you join us.
Well, we look forward to hearing what Marin County and how you decide to tackle climate change.
Yeah. It's going to be a big project, but we're up for it. So it's great. Great. So Nancy, do you want to take over?
Sure. So April and Eleanor, Eleanor already left. If you wanted to stick around, I'm going to talk about what we're doing next month, which will give you an idea of what we're doing here in Marin County.
Okay.
But first, I just wanted to say, having the history of the League's involvement with climate change going back to 1992, Eleanor, thank you so much for that. That was really helpful to see that history. And also between the US task force and the state task force, knowing that there is support and resources out there for us, because we're a fledgling committee here doing the best we can to learn as much as we can. So it's really nice to have that support. Also, so in regards to May, let me just tell you, next month, this is so timely. This past Sunday in the IJ, many of you might have read the article about Drawdown Marin being created as a nonprofit here in Marin County. Alex Portashava has headed up that whole effort since 2016, and Alex is our speaker for our May meeting, which will be May 26th, which is not the third Tuesday of the month, it's the fourth Wednesday. But we had to change it in order to accommodate Alex's schedule. And I really am thrilled that she can join us. And again, the timing, we lined her up a while ago, but with Drawdown Marin now becoming a nonprofit, the timing is perfect to better understand the goals and strategies that Drawdown Marin has put in place over 4 years of community input, and now moving into a new phase as a nonprofit as to how some of these things are going to become a reality in regards to the issues that we're dealing with here in Marin.